You ever been on a sales call where you were just crushing it? The prospect was eating out of the palm of your hand and you were literally already spending the money in another browser tab. But then the prospect said the 8 words of sales death.
I need some time to think about it.
And you knew they had every intention of ghosting your ass the second they hung up, but you were powerless to do anything about it. What if there was a strategy that could close those prospects now so they don't even have an opportunity to ghost you? When I started using this strategy, we made an extra $15,000 the first week that we implemented it. No sneaky tactics, no high pressure, and it's dead simple. It does take confidence and a bit of courage, but I'm gonna show you exactly how I do it down to a script you can use yourself. I built my agency Kenji ROI to 25 employees before exiting. But for the first few years of my agency, I always ended a sales call with sending them an email with the invoice. It felt uncomfortable asking for payment. I didn't want to be pushy and risk losing the sale. Sending the email was way more comfortable for me and them, and I didn't want to ruin that nice rapport that we built earlier on the call. The problem was, many of the people that seemed totally certain on the call would just end up ghosting me. They wouldn't reply to that email or the next email that I send. They were just gone. And after we hit a plateau in our sales, I hired a sales mentor with more than $50 million in sales under his belt for some advice. What he said next changed the way that I look at sales forever. He said, you need to ask for payment before ending the call without being pushy, but just the subtle pressure of asking is enough for many people. This was mind-blowing for me because I always thought as closing on the call as something pushy and super salesy that Grant Cardone might teach you, for example, but this was far more natural. The concept is simple, but the execution is really nuanced because through asking for the sale, you get to see how interested they really are. And if you end the call before asking, they might have some objections that they didn't tell you before, and you wouldn't have the opportunity to address those objections because you'd never get a hold of them again. So one of the most important nuances to making this work is providing subtle pressure without being pushy. Now, being too pushy is going to scare a lot of people off, but if you relieve the pressure completely by just ending the call, then your close rate is going to go way down. You're basically killing all the momentum you created on that call. Their brain is thinking about this problem right now, but sending them the email, it just gives them the opportunity to go do something else. They're back to their Instagram or back to work, and they'll come back to thinking about your product or service in, who knows, 1 day, 2 days, maybe never. That's the problem. Okay, so here's my process for how to close on the call in a natural but effective way. By this point of the call, you should have already explained your offer. You should have tried to dig out as many objections as you possibly can so that it's natural, because if you just try to close out of nowhere, it seems really weird and it seems pushy. So for this to work, you have to address any of their objections. Otherwise, asking for the payment is going to trigger those objections anyways. They should already know the price. If they haven't heard the price yet and you're trying to force them into payment, it's also a little bit pushy and weird. And to be sure you've done a good job of those things, you need to test their certainty before asking for the payment. So what I like to say here is, okay, great. So I think we've covered everything we need to here. Just want to make sure before moving on, does this look like what you had in mind? And the point of asking that is to dig out any final objections and just gauge how interested they are. Because if they seem like, nah, I'm not so interested, then you shouldn't try to ask for the payment. You should try to dig more into objections. But if they seem fairly certain, like maybe an 8 out of 10 or more, then you can move on to assuming the close. If you ask someone, is there anything you're unsure about? A lot of the time they'll just say, no, everything's fine. But if you ask them, what specifically are you unsure about? Then they're much more likely to actually think about it for a second and give you an answer. And assuming we're all good there, the next step is to assume the close. Ask for the payment. And because you just tested their certainty, it doesn't seem out of nowhere or pushy. Basically, you want to naturally guide them through the payment process as if this is just the next step for everybody in your onboarding process. And for me personally, my mental frame when asking for the payment is almost like this is a boring routine administrative thing. It's like, okay, so next step is to pay, and let's just go into it. So here's the actual script of what I say. Okay, great. So next step is to pay. I just sent you the payment link in the Zoom chat. You see that? Then you wait for them to respond, and then you move to step 3 based on what they say. So outcome A is there's no objections. And obviously this is the best case scenario. It means that you did a good job of handling your objections and then communicating the value of your product or service. And if you're doing a good job, you should have somewhere around 50% of the people just going along with it, which is something that blew my mind when I started doing this. So usually they would say something like, okay, give me a moment to grab my card. And then you would say, okay, no worries. worries. I'll just do some stuff in the background here. So let me know when that's gone through and I'll walk you through onboarding. So one thing that's really important here is I say that I'll let them know I'm gonna stay on the call with them until they complete the payment. Otherwise, they'll often try to say something like, okay, great, so I'll send you an email once it's through or something. They try to end the call because to them, it's slightly uncomfortable with you there still. But that's important. It's very important that you're still there so they feel that subtle pressure to go and get their credit card and actually pay. And outcome B is they lightly object. So this means that you've done a pretty good job of selling, but there's probably still one or two little objections left that you haven't identified yet. So they say, oh, I have to pay now? So they're not directly saying, I'm not interested or I don't want to pay now. And you can say something like, I mean, it's just easiest if we do it now while I'm here so I can walk you through the onboarding, but we can do it later if you need. Is cash flow tight right now, or do you need approval from your partner? And then you would just insert whatever you think their objection is right there. If they're not ready to pay now, there's always a reason. So some objection that you haven't addressed, or they're not convinced that the value that you provide is actually worth the cost. The goal in outcome B is to take the pressure off, tell them, I mean, you don't need to pay now, but what is the objection? And outcome C is they disqualify themselves. So this usually means that you shouldn't have started to ask for the close. They definitely have some objections that you haven't been able to address, or they're just really not interested in the value of your product or service. So they'll say, I'm not ready to pay now, I'm not sure yet, something that directly disqualifies themselves from paying now. And then you can say, okay, no worries. So is it something specific about the offer you're unsure of or something else? Now the goal here is you really want to figure out what the problem is for them so that you can address it. You don't want to let them just end the call and say, I'll get back to you, because we all know they're never going to get back to you. You want to really dig into objections at this point. And oftentimes in this stage, you're not going to be able to actually address those objections on the call. So a common one would be, I need to talk to my business partner or my spouse. And sometimes you can address those. I'm not going to go into that in this video. A lot of the time, you're going to have to shift the goal to setting up that secondary call. Be something like, okay, so do you think you can have that conversation with your partner by Friday? All right, great. How about we set up a second call with you and your partner on Monday, same time? And then key point here is you want to actually open up your calendar while you're still on the call so that you can book that in with them. Because same thing, if you send, I'll send you an email or my calendar link, they may or may not ever get to that email, and they're much more likely to show up to a call that you booked with them. And then step 3.5 is an optional step that may or may not happen, and that's troubleshooting payment issues. So things can go wrong with the credit card, like their card was declined due to a daily or a weekly transaction limit. And the solution in that case is to create 2 split payments and do that with them on the phone. Go create 2 invoices or whatever you have to do in your payment system. You can also offer, if they have a PayPal account or if they can do bank transfer, is a good way to get around that. Sometimes the payment link isn't working. So you can ask them to try a different browser. Failing that, you can ask them for the credit card number so you can input it from your end. If you want a written version of this script, you can click the link below this video. Check out this video over here for how toxic hustle culture got me to 7 figures.